Major, I don't know where I came from. I was found floating in the Norris Belt, and nobody knew where I came from. So all my life I wondered what my origins were, and if I truly ever did have a home. Yeah, that's all well and good, Odo, but I just asked you if you wanted a coffee. Oh, yeah, sure. I'll have 2 sugars and a little bit of cream. Dun 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun. Hello, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Emissary, which is episode 1 of season 1 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video begins a series of videos in which I review every episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, one episode at a time. In this episode, I cover the Deep Space Nine series premiere, Emissary. So, Emissary is the episode where Sisko is assigned to Deep Space Nine to overlook the Bajor, which has recently gone through a 50-year occupation of the Cardassians, and so their world is in chaos. But in doing so, he discovers a wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant, the other side of the galaxy, near Bajor. So he and his first officer, Major Kira, of the Bajoran militia, work together to move Deep Space Nine to the wormhole, and Sisko then negotiates with the aliens inside the wormhole to negotiate passage to the wormhole, while Major Kira deals with the Cardassian attack, which Sisko ends by towing a Cardassian ship through the wormhole. So, I want to talk about Deep Space Nine first. Yes, I have reviewed some other episodes of Deep Space Nine, as if you're not aware of my channel, so it's not like I haven't covered Deep Space Nine on my channel before, but I am beginning the process of going through every episode, one at a time, and I've been doing Next Generation, and I'll still be doing Next Generation, by the way, because I'm not finished, because I'm reviewing the episodes as they aired, in the order in which they aired. So this, I'm in the middle of season 6 of TNG, because that's when Deep Space Nine started airing, was in the middle of season 6 of TNG. But I have been doing Next Generation for a while, so it is a bit refreshing to get a different, more variety, and get into a different show. However, the thing is that season 1 of Deep Space Nine is not that good. So Deep Space Nine continues the tradition of, well, it happened with 3 shows in the Berman era, or I can't really call it the Michael Piller era because he wasn't involved in Enterprise. So the Berman era. 3 out of 4 of the shows had this thing where the first 2 seasons were not very good. I was going to say the first 2 seasons were the worst season of the show, but actually I don't really think that's true of Deep Space Nine, because I personally think season 2 of DS9 is slightly better than season 5, but that is something I will get to. So I actually think season 5 is my second least favorite of the show, and season 1 is clearly my least favorite, because the show really hadn't found its footing. The actors haven't found this footing. The writers haven't found their footing. They didn't really find their independent voice. It came off a bit too much like Next Generation. But the thing in Deep Space Nine is it's my favorite Star Trek show. In fact, one time I called it my favorite show of all time, although I'm not sure if I still feel that way. It's The Expanse is probably, I've called The Expanse my favorite show of all time as one time, so it's close between those two, to be honest. Used to be Game of Thrones until the last 2 seasons completely destroyed the show, and I dropped heavily because of those. But so now it's between The Expanse and Deep Space Nine. But clearly, Deep Space Nine is my favorite Star Trek show. And Deep Space Nine is not a perfect show. It's got many flaws. There's many things about it that, like any other Star Trek show, especially these older ones that have 26 episodes per season, you're going to get a lot of duds. There's a lot of bad episodes. In fact, I think the worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise comes from Deep Space Nine, but we won't get to that until season 6. Although I did already cover that on my channel. And there's some things that Deep Space Nine did that I didn't totally agree with. I'm not a huge fan of the lead actor who plays the main character, which I'll talk a little bit about in this video. And they had a few storylines that didn't like. As I said, I think the show dipped a bit in season 5. Like it was going, season 1 was, as I said, not that good, and I understand why a lot of people turned off by it and didn't keep watching. And season 2 was better, but still not as good. Season 3 is when the show got really good. Season 4 continued that really strength. Season 5, it dipped. It was just really a bland season, which I think it was actually slightly worse than season 2. But then it came back with a vengeance with season 6, although season 6 had a lot of amazing episodes, but it also had some terrible episodes. I said the worst episode of the franchise was from season 6. And then season 7, the first half of season 7 was mediocre, but then the second half was amazing. So that's not to say it's a perfect show. And season 4 and 5 meandered. It did a storyline with the Klingons becoming the main enemies, and so they switched focus from the Dominion to the Klingons, and I think that was a massive mistake. Season 4 still had strong writing, even though they had that storyline that shouldn't have been there, but season 5, I think it tanked it. So that's a fault. That was a massive mistake that they wasted 2 years on this Klingon becoming enemies again, which they never should have, because they work so much better in the modern era of Trek as hostile allies than they do with enemies. So that was a massive mistake. They wanted to bring Worf on. Go ahead, bring Worf on. But for the people who say, oh, the show got better when they brought Worf on, I completely disagree. I think the show got better when they brought the Defiant in. It got better in season when they focused on Dominion in season 3. That's when the show got good. And then there's Ira Steven Behr, the showrunner, who obviously has done a really amazing job since it's one of my favorite shows of all time. But there's a lot of tendencies that he has that annoy me or that I don't agree with. For example, he really is against Roddenberry's vision. I think he doesn't understand the concept of the Federation and sometimes purposely writes against them. I think for the most part he was tempered by Rick Berman to not take it too far, but other times, I didn't agree with him. And plus he had this obsession towards the end of the show of turning Sisko into a god and making it all be about religion, which I didn't really care for. And they had a lot of retcons, which I know Ronald D. Moore, who was one of the head producers, writers in the later seasons, he loves to retcon things. That's the amazing writer, by the way. Love him, but he doesn't give a shit about retcons. He just loves the retcon shit, and so there were some terrible retcons towards the end of the show. And also, Ira Steven Behr was obsessed with doing Ferengi episodes, 1 or 2 a season, and all of them sucked balls. Like, the Ferengi episodes were easily the worst episodes of like the whole franchise. And well, there was like 1 or 2 good ones. There was one really good one and a couple of decent ones, but most of them suck balls. And then there was, of course, Vic Fontaine, who I think is the worst character in the entire Star Trek franchise, which had to do with Ira Steven Behr's stupid obsession with lounge singers, and had this turned the episodes he was in into a cheesy variety show when he was singing fucking Frank Sinatra song in the middle of my deep, dark, contemplative, complex sci-fi show. I don't want to spend 5 minutes watching some jackass sing Frank Sinatra songs. So all that were its flaws, and of course its first season, as I said, was very flawed. So those are the show's flaws, but the reason why, despite all those flaws, I would still say it is the best show of the franchise is like, unlike other Star Trek shows, it relies less on technobabble and more on characters, which specifically is why I like it better than Next Gen. And it also makes it better than Voyager. It has very strong characters, which is why it's better than Enterprise, which has weak, bland characters. Also, it's what I love as a Star Trek fan. I know other Star Trek fans everyone has their niche or different aspect that they like to focus on. There's some people who like the fact that it's a starship going out into space with a crew and exploring different worlds, and so those people weren't a huge fan of DS9. I remember when this show first came out, I kept hearing over and over again of why they just sitting still. Why they just stay sitting there. They're not going anywhere. And that was a huge, breaking point. That was a huge issue for many fans. I didn't give a shit. Because what attracted me to Star Trek was not a ship going out and exploring space. It was the world building. It was the complex world building. It was creating a fantasy world. It was getting to know these characters and the political situation, the different aliens, and how they interact with each other, and how different individuals of an alien race could be different from other different individuals, and how do they react with this one. And this is what Deep Space Nine focuses on. In fact, Deep Space Nine has a diverse cast in terms of aliens. Only half of this main cast are Starfleet officers, a little bit more than half. And not all of them were human. And so you get all these different aliens, and as the show progressed, because we're at a space station and we're not constantly going to one-off place to place, you have, even before we get into the serialized stuff of season 6 and 7, even before that, you build stuff. You happens in one episode has consequences in the next one, because you're there. You're not moving on to the next planet. You're still there. You still got to deal with the consequences. You still got a spy, sleazy Cardassian Garrick with Taylor, who's there the whole time. He's not going anywhere. And so that leads to a much bigger supporting cast as well, because the more that the show goes on, the more it builds and introduces supporting characters who will be around. It just builds and builds and builds, and it has a gigantic cast of supporting characters, many of whom are more popular than some of the main characters. Like Garrick, for example, is a supporting character, is probably the most popular character. Also Gul Dukat, one of the probably the best villain of the Star Trek franchise. And you get all these other supporting characters that just builds and builds and builds until the end of the show. It's you got a giant cast of characters, and the supporting characters are sometimes more important than the main ones. Like Nog, towards the end of the show, became more of a main character than Jake did. So I love that. That's what I love about it. And also the serialized nature of it does help, and I think it was groundbreaking. And I think it's what Star Trek always should have done. But on top of that, the themes of Deep Space Nine, as I said, they don't focus on the technobabble as much, which does get tedious with Next Gen. I'm definitely noticing that going through every episode of Next Gen, particularly when we get to Season 5. I complained about that a lot in Season 5. Is that, and even Season 4 and 3 to a lesser extent, and definitely continues in Season 6 and 7, is that, I'm coming across a weird anomaly and technobabble this, technobabble that. It gets a bit tiring, and there is some of that in Season 1 of DS9, which is why I said it's my least favorite of the show. But going forward, Deep Space Nine really gets away from that and focuses more on the characters, on the political aspect of it, on the intrigue, and that's what I find more interesting. And so that's why it's my favorite Star Trek shows. Sisko's not my favorite captain. Picard's my favorite captain, but that's not a deciding factor for me. A deciding factor is how interesting the stories are, and also it has more hard-hitting stories, darker themes. Yeah, and that overall, I just think it just makes it the best Star Trek show. So getting into this episode specifically, this is not my favorite pilot. Some people call it their favorite pilot. But it's my second favorite of the Legacy Trek shows. But if we include the modern Trek shows, I believe it had number 4 behind the Picard pilot, which is one of the only good episodes of that show. The Strange New Worlds pilot, and then the Voyager pilot, and then this. Because I actually do like the Voyager pilot a bit better than this one. Because the main reason why is because, as I alluded to with my intro there, I think that the exposition of the way they introduced characters was really clunky. I think Voyager did a much better job at that. And plus, the story, I think, was more cohesive, more exciting. And I talked before, my main stance on this episode is that the A-plot was Sisko and the Prophets, and basically the character story that Sisko goes through was great. But the B-plot with Kira and the Cardassians attacking the station, not so good. The B-plot really brings the episode down. Because, so talking about Sisko's character story, I think when I watched this episode just now, I didn't like it as much as I thought it would, because I was thinking about the Sisko character story. I'm like, wow, it's so amazing, it's so good. But watching it, it drags a little bit. So we open up with a flashback to Wolf 359. And see Sisko there, and his wife dies, and he holds a grudge against Picard. Let me start by saying I think this was a mistake. First of all, because the Borg never appear on Deep Space Nine ever again, and the Borg is not what the show's about. In fact, the Deep Space Nine, very wisely, by the way, unlike Voyager, very wisely avoided using the Borg and instead focused on its own thing. Therefore, having the very first scene of the entire show be a flashback with the Borg kind of seems out of place. I think it would have made more sense if Sisko's wife died in a battle with the Cardassians, because the Cardassians are the fucking main villains of the fucking show. So then he would have a personal stake involved. But, then again, maybe Starfleet wouldn't assign someone with that personal grudge against the Cardassians in a situation where they're constantly dealing with Cardassians. But still, it would have been more relevant, and it would have made a lot more sense. Now, the reason why they chose this moon is so they could for several reasons. First of all, they wanted to fan service. That's the biggest reason. Because they want to attract more people to the new Star Trek show, and everyone loves Best of Both Worlds. It's his favorite episode. And everyone complained, including me, about the fact that in Best of Both Worlds Part 2, we just hear about the Wolf 359 battle, and it happens off screen, and then we see the aftermath, and we don't actually see the battle. So wouldn't it be cool if we actually saw the battle? And I agree, this was cool, and for me, I was blown away. I was like, holy shit, we finally get to see the Battle of Wolf 359. So that's one reason. The other reason is so that they could have the plot with Picard and Sisko in this episode, where Sisko's like angry at Picard and holds a grudge against him and wants to quit, and yeah. So as for the fan service, that's fan service. You got to do what's best for the show, not service the fans. And I think it would have been better for the show if they had the battle be with the Cardassians. So that should come first more than for servicing fans. So as for the thing with Picard, why do you need to have Sisko pissed off at Picard? Like that actually turned a lot of people off, and I know a lot of people who watched the pilot episode gave up after it because, like, well, fuck this is the main character's being a dick to Picard, and Picard's awesome. And even some people who stuck with the show is like, I'll watch it, but I don't like this Sisko asshole because he's a dick to Picard. So, am I saying that's right? Am I saying I agree with that? It doesn't really matter. The fact is, a lot of people have that reaction. Whether you agree with that reaction, whether you think that reaction is justified or not, a lot, especially casual viewers, somewhat casual, who are familiar with Picard, are going to have that reaction of it's going to turn them off. So why do that? That's my question. Not that I'm saying it was a bad storyline, because it does work for Sisko's character story. I will grant you, and anyone saying that, that's true. But it's not very smart if you want to attract viewers. You instantly turn them off. And plus, I think Sisko, and this is what I always thought, and I still think this 3 decades later, that Sisko's being unfair to Picard. Now, I understand he lost his wife, so he's not going to be completely and totally reasonable about this, and that he's going to have strong emotions that he can't control. But it wasn't Picard. It was the Borg captured him, abducted him, violated him, and forced him to do things against his will, like brainwashed him. And so, and this gets into my whole argument about Captain America Civil War as why Tony Stark was pissed off at the Winter Soldier, but that because he was brainwashed. But so I don't know. It's just maybe I'm different, but for me, no matter how personally upset or hurt I am, I couldn't see myself wanting to kill or be absolutely pissed off at someone who was abused and used as a tool and brainwashed and forced by someone else to do something. I'd be more pissed off at the people who forced that person to do that than I would at the tool that they used to do it. I don't know. And maybe if I was actually in that situation, maybe I'd feel differently, but honestly, like, I don't think so. Like, it's just, I don't know. Maybe other people look at it differently, but I don't get upset with the tool. I get upset with who is wielding the tool. So he should be pissed off at the Borg, not at Picard. And so I never really liked this, to be honest. The whole fact that Sisko was always really, pissy with Picard. To be fair, I think I did have that gut reaction when I first saw it of, oh, why is he being so, such a dick to Picard? I wasn't expecting that. And so, and there was a lot of things I wasn't expecting with this pilot, because I read an article, and several articles, but I remember reading one specifically in Entertainment Weekly before Deep Space Nine came out, a couple of months, saying, this new Star Trek show is going to take place in a space station. So I was imagining like a starbase, like a Starfleet starbase, and it would be like, those cone-shaped ones that you see, and it would have like a whole Starfleet crew, and it would be like next gen. And then I saw pictures, and it was like, they said, no, it's Cardassian's station, looks weird and grungy. And I was like, okay, so who's our main crew? And half them, or like two or three of them, are not even wearing Starfleet uniforms. I'm like, what the fuck? And they're called Major? Major's not a rank that they use in Starfleet commonly. Like, what's going on? And then, and then I watched it, and I was not prepared for this tone. I was not prepared for there to be so much conflict within the crew itself. And I wouldn't say I hated it. As you can probably know, I got used to it and ended up loving it. As I mentioned, my whole rant about why Deep Space Nine is my favorite show. But when I first saw it, I was caught off guard. I wouldn't say that I hated it. I was just caught off guard. It was not what I was expecting, and it just took me a few episodes to adjust to it because it's not what I expected. But of course, once I got used to it, and especially once the show started getting good, I thought this was actually better than just having a bunch of Starfleet officers on the bridge of a ship. And that's another thing I noticed about DS9 is in the first season, they treat ops like the same way they would treat the bridge on TNG, where that was the main place you go to. This was the center. This is where all the action happens. But as the show progresses and goes on, ops becomes less and less important. And by the time we get towards the end of the show, like season 4, 5, 6, and 7, they barely show ops. Ops becomes is used in the same fashion or the same frequency as, say, the observation lounge in TNG is used. A place where they get together and talk and collaborate about what's going on in the current situation. So it's not like the main thing. There is no, if you're asking me, well, Mark, where is the main thing where everything happens? There is none. And of course, once you introduce Defiant, then the Defiant-based episodes, the bridge becomes the bridge. And so ops becomes less important. But anyway, and I do apologize to anyone who's watching Deep Space Nine for the first time. I don't know if anyone watches my reviews who hasn't seen the show before, because I don't hold back on spoilers. I probably should have gave that warning before, but this is something I've always do. I always talk about future shit in my videos. But anyway, so yeah, if you haven't seen DS9 before, you're gonna have to get used to that or be okay with that if you want to watch my reviews. But anyway, so yeah, that was weird. So I see why this pilot could be off-putting for some people because of the Picard thing and because of the conflict within the characters. Not all of them are Starfleet. But yeah, so with Sisko, with the Sisko storyline, it is a really good character story because it begins with the tragedy of his wife, and I think that makes sense because it's anchors the story, or anchors his character story, gives you his mindset. He's raising a kid alone. He gets an assignment that he doesn't particularly want, but he still tries to do a good job. He shows by the way he handles Quark and the way he handles Kira that he's actually the right man for the job, and so you get the impression of why Starfleet assigned him to it, because he seems to be fit for it, but he just still doesn't really want to be there. And he meets with the religious leader, and she says, oh yes, it's ironic, one that does not wish to be among us is to be the emissary. And so she thinks he's going to be this religious figure and discover the celestial temple. And so he gets together with Dax, who he knew from before, and they discover the celestial temple is actually a stable wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant, the first one known to exist. The Barzan wormhole turned out to be a lemon. They thought that was the first stable wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant, but it turned out it's shifted to the Delta Quadrant. But anyway, so they discover the first stable wormhole, but he gets stuck in it, and he has to make first contact with the aliens who live in the wormhole, and they exist outside of linear time, so he has to sort of explain what Starfleet is about, what the Federation is about, how they just want to live peacefully with each other, but these aliens are able to kind of go inside his mind and force him to relive events, and he keeps reliving the death of his wife over and over again. And so he asks, why are you forcing me to do this? And they try to make it clear, it's like, no, we don't bring you here, you bring us here. And he has to come to terms with the fact that he hasn't gotten over his wife's death, and that he keeps reliving that moment over and over again in his mind because it's a moment he can't look past. And by opening up to them and coming to that personal realization himself, he's able to make the prophets, or the wormhole aliens as they're called this. They're not actually referred to as the prophets until much later. I mean, Kaiopaka kind of did, but really it's not till later they call them prophets. So in the earlier seasons I like to call them the wormhole aliens. But anyway, he makes the wormhole aliens understand what he means to be linear and what his species is all about, so they understand him better, and so they agree to allow them to use the wormhole on a permanent basis. And so he grabs Ducat's ship, takes it back to DS9, and saves DS9 from the Cardassian attack. So yeah, that was a strong character story. Now, it does meander a bit. This is what I forgot about rewatching it, like some of the scenes where he's talking with the wormhole aliens and they're doing the Jennifer thing, and she's being like, "Kiss, what is this?" Like it, and the whole baseball thing. Michael Polish is too obsessed with baseball. And yeah, the whole baseball thing, it does drag on a little bit, and so it can get a little bit tedious, but all in all, pacing issues aside, I think it is a strong character story, and I see it has a good hook, and because D Space Nine, as I said, first and foremost, is great character stories, which is why I love the show so much. So that was a good hook. So that was a good way to do this episode. Problem is, you get the B plot. The B plot is not very interesting. It throws, first of all, when Sisko's still there, it throws character after character. So the introduction of Kira, I think, was pretty straightforward. It was, I don't think the Federation has any right to be here. Again, I wasn't really thrilled with the way that his first officer was like pissy and didn't like him. It's funny because they used this premise, and I talked about this before. They used the premise of having different non-Starfleet officers there in order to create tension. It was a way to skirt the Roddenberry box, because they didn't want to defy the Roddenberry box, which is there's no conflict between our characters because the Federation is perfect and the 24th century is perfect and humanity has evolved to be awesome. But Roddenberry allowed, well, aliens might not be so awesome, so it's okay to have conflict with aliens. So to skirt around, well, we can't have conflict between our main characters, let's make half our main characters aliens. Therefore, they're not the perfect Federation, therefore they can conflict with each other. And I think that's a little bit of a cheat, and you get some little conflict between the characters towards the end of the show, but for the most, like, this Kira and Sisko conflict goes away pretty damn quick. Which is also my complaint about Voyager, about having the Maquis. It was useless because the conflict between the Maquis and Starfleet officers goes away too fucking quick, where what's the point of even doing it? And I think the same, maybe to a lesser degree, but the same is true of the Kira or Sisko conflict, that by the end of the season they're best friends, so it seems like that it wasn't really necessary to have them. They just want to create this tension at the start. So I wasn't the biggest fan of it. And it is interesting, Kira, though, her position of, I don't think the Federation has any right to be here. So that is a kind of interesting place to start. So I didn't have that big of an issue with it. But so the introduction of Quark, that was okay. The introduction of Odo was okay, I guess. But the introduction of Jadzia and Bashir was handled very poorly, extremely poorly, and they just kind of throw in character after character. And Bashir and Dax were both not developed until like later seasons. Like this season, they didn't really know what to do with them, and they both kind of came off as kind of one-note characters. Bashir they made him arrogant and annoying, which I can't wait till they get to the later seasons when they stop doing that. And then you have, well, with Odo, you have the scene that I alluded to in my intro, where he just all of a sudden blurts out exposition, and that happens a lot. And like the whole orb experience that Jadzia had was another example of them just blur. Oh, look, this explains that she's a Trill. Like, I think it was a very clunky way to throw exposition at the audience. Yeah, the whole thing with Odo, like, being, I don't know where I came from. It's like, all right, Odo. Like, people wouldn't talk like that. And then the whole plot line with the Cardassians attacking the station, like, that was boring. I didn't really like that. That didn't really make any sense. It never made sense to me of when Kira says to the Cardassian, you don't think Starfleet would take command of the station without giving it the ability to defend itself, do you? But she's bluffing. But she makes sense. Why the fuck did Starfleet let the Federation take over the station if they're not gonna give it the armament to defend itself? That makes zero sense. I don't know why. And instead, they just give them these dinky runabouts that are essentially shuttlecraft. I mean, why don't you it takes until season 3. In fact, I don't think it really takes effect until the beginning of season 4, until they actually finally arm the station. I'm sorry. Like, maybe it doesn't need to be this huge battle thing that it is in season 4, but they should have given it more than 6 photon torpedoes, maybe let them be able to defend itself against 3 Cardassian ships. Just a thought. I mean, it later is able to defend itself of an entire fleet of, like, Klingon ships or an entire Dominion fleet, but 3 Cardassian ships and is completely defenseless about it. Yeah, there needs to be a middle ground there. They should have armed the goddamn station better than that. And the whole thing with, like, Kira, like, bluffing and being like, oh yeah, the way she says, oh, and maybe if I was a Starfleet officer, they might admit, you're right, this is a hopeless cause, but I'm just a Bajoran, and I've been fighting a hopeless cause my whole life. That was, again, bad dialogue. That was bad exposition. Every time I hear that, I think of, but I'm just a caveman. Unfrozen caveman lawyer. These weird devices, they frighten me. Like, when the phone rings, I say, what is that noise? Because I'm just a caveman. Anyway, the way she says, I'm just a terrorist, that's what it makes me think of. But anyways, it doesn't work. And I don't think it's particularly good acting. And it's just, I get bored with it. And I'm like, can we go back to because I talked about how the Prophet stuff sort of, the Wormhole and stuff, how that kind of drags a bit. But even so, I'd rather go back to it than this. Whenever I'm at this part, I'm like, all right, when is this going to be over? Can we get back to this Sisko stuff? Yeah, it's it's funny that we got a bit of irony here because they use, like, mirrors and stuff to make it look like they have all these weapons, and they don't. And the Cardassians, like, it's a trick, they're just using mirrors and stuff. Whereas in season 4, episode 1, The Way of the Warrior, same thing happens where the Klingons say all these weapons and photon torpedoes, and they're like, oh, it's a trick, they're just using mirrors. But in that case, they weren't. They actually were armed to the teeth. But in this case, they didn't have any weapons to speak of. Which, why would Starfleet take control of a station and not even give it, like, the bare minimum of weapons? But anyway, I just find that ridiculous. And plus, they're in hostile territory. They're surrounded by the Cardassian territory because this used to be considered Cardassian territory. So this brings me to another discussion, another issue I had with this episode, is instead of spending time with the clunky, crappy exposition or showing a flashback to the Borg, which we never, ever see of ever in the show, I think they should have spent more time explaining why the Cardassians withdrew from the occupation. Because this was never clear, and I think they kind of gloss over it. They just said, oh, the Cardassians evacuated, they're no longer occupying Bajor. Why? Now, they addressed this in later episodes a little bit, just a little bit. In Duet, Maritza, posing as Goldal Hero, is talking to Kira, and Kira says, "Oh, we're not that helpless. We did defeat you." And his response was, "Leaving was a political decision, Major." Okay, it was a political decision. And in season 2, episode Cardassian, it's been a while since I've seen it. I believe they mentioned something about the civilian government, the Kappa, whatever they're called, the PACA council, that they made a decision to withdraw from Bajor, and there was one guy in particular who was a civilian leader. Dukat was trying to destroy his career because he was upset. He didn't want to leave Bajor. And maybe there was a couple references later on that I'm not thinking of. But for the most part, like in this episode, they didn't really address it. They're like, oh yeah, the Cardassians withdrew. And then the episode starts after. Like, well after. Why? Instead of wasting time giving us fan service at the start of the episode, maybe they should give some more background on the Cardassian occupation of Bajor, explain what was happening during the occupation, why they decided to evacuate. Now, there's some theories out there that are complete headcanon. Like, they're totally not in canon. It's never explained in the show itself. One could infer this, but it's still headcanon. There's the headcanon that the events of Chain of Command caused the Cardassians to withdraw from Bajor. That because the Federation's been pressuring the Cardassians to stop occupying Bajor, and at first they were like, fuck off. But because they were caught red-handed, like trying to take over, doing a plot trying to take over Federation star system, and they were caught torturing a Starfleet captain, that hurt them politically, and because of that, they had to make some concessions to the Federation in order to, maintain the peace and sort of the smooth diplomatic relations over with them, and so they withdrew from Bajor in order to smooth things over with them. And it's because that's one thing that they've been wanting. And again, this is headcanon; it's never stated, but this is the headcanon that because of that, that's why the Cardassian. And I think there was even a novel or B canon that I heard about. I didn't read it personally, that did explicitly state this, that it was because of the Jellicoe stuff in Chain of Command is why the Cardassians left. But that's not canon. It's not in the episode itself, because Chain of Command was actually written and filmed after this was filmed and in the can. The original, I talked about this in my revisited for Chain of Command. The original idea of Chain of Command actually didn't even have the Cardassians in it. It was just a one episode. It wasn't a two-parter, and it was just about Jellicoe coming in and taking command. But I think they wanted to set up Deep Space Nine, so the decision was made, let's add in the Cardassians, and we'll add in this plot of the torture, which wasn't there originally. And that was done like really late in the game, like practically right before they filmed it. In fact, the actor who played Gold Madrid only had like 3 days to prep before the role, and he had to have cue cards on the set because he didn't know all of his lines, and that's because they kind of changed the script at the last second. And so this was well after Deep Space Nine aired. In fact, the original idea when Picard, Beverly, and Worf went to that Ferengi Solok or whatever to get passage, that was supposed to be Quark on Deep Space Nine, because it was supposed to air after. In fact, there's a line with Adam Nechayev saying, oh yeah, after the Cardassians moved their forces from the Bajoran sector, or after they evacuated the Bajoran sector. So it's even saying it happened after Emissary, but it's actually happening before. And if that headcanon is true, you gotta ignore that line that Nechayev says, because if you're saying they withdrew from Bajor because of the events of Chain of Command, then that doesn't make sense with Nechayev saying that they already evacuated Bajor before the events of Chain of Command. So I think that they should have taken more time to explain exactly why the Cardassians withdrew from Bajor. Because my headcanon, and I don't really care about chain of command, but my headcanon is that well, maybe you could add in the chain of command stuff, but what's more important to me is that the Federation was pushing for Cardassia to evacuate Bajor, and eventually they applied enough political pressure on them where it was no longer advantageous to keep it, that they risked more to keep it than they did to actually just leave and let the Federation have it, so they did that. They probably, for the most part, they pretty much, and this is described in later episodes of DS9, that they pretty much depleted most of Bajor's resources anyway at this stage. And so by this stage, it was riskier, diplomatically to keep it than to just give it away. And that's why the Federation comes in immediately to help, because they're the ones that were pushing for it to go. Now, this is something I talked about in Ensign Row, about how some people are complaining about the Federation for not going in and stopping the Cardassian occupation, because they say, oh, it's because of the Prime Directive, and fuck the Prime Directive. But it's actually more complicated than just the Prime Directive. And I talked about, as I said, I talked about this in Ensign Row, that legally, or at least as far as the Cardassians were concerned, they occupied Bajor, and so Bajor was Cardassian space. So the Federation went in there by force and tried to use force to remove Cardassians from Bajor. Legally, that would be Starfleet invading a sovereign territory of another superpower and attacking them. So by anyone's definition, an act of war. So it would definitely 100% be declaring war and starting war against the Cardassians. And that's not something that Starfleet does. Now granted, Sisko will start a war with the Dominion later on, but that's a completely different situation, because in that case the Dominion are going to conquer the Alpha Quadrant. Like, everyone knows that that's their goal, and so they're just preemptively attacking them before they get their forces too strong where they're not going to be able to defend themselves against them. So that's a completely different situation. Under circumstances like this, no, the Federation, the Starfleet, does not go in and attack another sovereign superpower's territory and start a war. Now, yes, what they're doing with the Bajoran occupation is absolutely horrendous, but, there's been allusions to the Klingons doing this to other planets, and the Federation considers them great allies. So we're not, maybe not to this extent. There's no proof that the Klingons were doing this, doing a Holocaust the way that the Cardassians were towards the Bajoran, but still, they were occupying other planets and conquering them and forcing them to live under, servitude of the Klingon Empire. And the Federation's like, no, that's all good. We're buddies. So, yes, so that's complicated in that regard. But my bigger point was that going in and starting a war, which could kill millions of people. You could go in and free the Bajoran people, and then the Cardassians, in retaliation, kill millions of people in the Federation world. And maybe they take Bajor back, and maybe the Starfleet's unsuccessful in conquering Bajor, and you still start a war, and millions of people die. It's not a smart thing. War, and this is something that Star Trek has repeatedly hit over and over again, and again, Dominion War is a different situation, but in general, Star Trek's main theme, main focus is war is not a good thing. War is something to be avoided at all costs, and strategically, sometimes you gotta set that aside, like the Dominion War, but in general, that is something I 100% agree with. And that's why I love Star Trek. And so Starfleet starting a war with the Cardassians to free Bajor, as honorable and as a thing it might be, is not something they should do. Instead, what they did was applied political pressure. And this is something that happens in real life a lot of times. Nations will apply political or financial pressure rather than starting a war with another superpower that could cause a nuclear war, kill millions of people. They try to use political pressure on them. And that is what Starfleet did here. And I think that was wise, and I think it worked. And I think that's why the Cardassians withdrew from Bajor, is because Federation kept applying all this pressure to them. And maybe the chain of command stuff was the needle, the tipping point, the needle that broke the camel's back, whatever the saying is. Maybe that's the straw that broke the camel's back, whatever. Maybe that was the icing on the cake, the cherry on top, or whatever, that finally made the Cardassians give up. Sure, but it's all headcanon. And I wish it wasn't. I wish that this show spent more time. And I also don't like the fact that Sisko didn't seem to know anything about Cardassians and Bajorans, and yet he shows up and seems to know how to handle them. Like, again, like in Admiral Jellicoe's, or Captain Jellicoe, as much as I hate that fucker who's a bad captain, they established that he was experienced with Cardassians, and that's why they assigned him. So it would have been nice if they mentioned anything about Sisko having any prior knowledge of the Bajorans or Cardassians, but he seemed to have none. Yet he seemed to be able to handle it. So you could say, oh, maybe he did have some, they just didn't mention it. Why didn't they mention it? I think that's pretty fucking important. More important to show him in the battle with the goddamn Borg, who never show up on the show. I'm sorry. So that is a huge sticking point for me. So let's talk about acting. Yeah, so Rene Auberjonois, if that's how you pronounce his name, and Armin Shimmerman are amazing from the beginning. They're always good. Well, Rene Auberjonois is a little bit flatter in this episode, but he definitely improves. Like, he gets more lively later on, but he's still good. He's still solid. Quark is solid. Mark Alamo's Gul Dukat, solid. Like, that was such a great decision to get him in. Cal Meany as O'Brien. He's already got this character down packed after years of his supporting role in TNG, so he's perfect. Everyone else, not so good. So the guest stars, Kaiopaka's okay, I guess, not the best. But Jennifer Sisko, oh god, no. Not the worst actor I've seen, but definitely definitely not good. And as I mentioned, Terry Farrell, her whole season 1 performance is not going to be, because they don't, to be fair, the writers didn't really know how to write for her, and they tried to portray her as this wise, like 300-year-old wise being, which just didn't work. And Terry Farrell, I don't think, knew how to play it, so they didn't really find the character until season 2 when they decided to go in a different direction with her. And Nana Visitor, as I said, her season 1 performance is off and on. Duet's amazing, but that's at the end of the season. Until then, I think she struggles finding the character. I mean, it's okay. Her performance I don't think the Federation has any right to be here. It's decent. It's a pretty good performance. But, yeah. Alexander Siddig as Bashir. No, dinner or drink. I know he did that on purpose, but still, I don't know. I don't think it was a good performance. And Avery Brooks. Gotta talk about Avery Brooks. Ow! So, is that okay, Jake? Okay. Now, let me just say as a personal thing, as a personal pet peeve of mine when I say something and someone else repeats it back to me in a mocking way. And it's weird that this is still happening to me when I'm in my 40s to other people who are also fully grown adults. It seems like, this kind of shit should have stopped when I was 12 years old. But, I mean, if I'm talking to a 12-year-old doing that, okay, but it's usually not. It's usually someone who's a fully grown adult who is doing that shit. And that is a personal pet peeve of mine. I can't stand it when fucking people do that. I can't stand it when fucking people do that. No, see, I did that to myself. But no, it's a pet peeve. I think it's really dumb, immature, and annoys me. So when Sisko does this to his own son, that just irritated me. I'm like, what the fuck are you doing, asshole? But anyway, I don't know why. See, I just don't. It's not so much as okay. Avery Brooks does have some bad performances in here. But he has some good performances, but he also has some just puzzling acting choices. And I think that's going to be the main thing about Avery Brooks going forward. Now, if you haven't heard me talk about Avery Brooks before, he's an overactor. I don't think he's a particularly good actor. And when I did this top 10 favorite actors of Star Trek video like a long time ago, like 8 years or some shit, and it got thousands of views, and I got so many comments of people being like, why isn't Avery Brooks on this? Avery Brooks should be on this list. And the first person who said that responded saying, because he's not a good actor. And then after I just stopped responding because I couldn't believe how many people were like, oh, Avery Brooks is one of the best actors in Star Trek. Now, here's the thing about Avery Brooks. I'm positive that he's an amazing theatrical actor. If you go see a play, I'm sure he would be fucking amazing. And he's a good director. The few episodes that he directs in this, there's always amazing acting. So he obviously knows how to work with actors, and he's a great director. I don't think he's really good as far as TV/film acting goes, because there is a huge difference between theater acting and film acting, something I learned about a lot when I went to film school, when I went to drama school, took drama courses. And I've noticed to spot the difference, and this is not good film acting, or TV acting, if you will, either way. It is not good in general. Now, there's some his worst performances in this episode, and I think this will be a recurring theme throughout season 1, if not the whole show, is when he's having the plain, mundane lines, like he's saying, "Oh, have the ship dock at docking bay 3, and did you have this back online?" Like, the way he reads lines like that just sounds like he's reading lines. It doesn't sound particularly realistic, and he has a certain cadence to his voice that I find artificial. So I think that's actually his worst acting. And the strange choices is the stuff like when he goes, like he's on the beach, and he goes, "I want to," and he sees his wife Jennifer, and he's like, "To, ow! Do you know how incredible this is?" That's just weird. Like, so it's not, because people don't talk like that unless they're like really weird. So maybe he's portraying Sisko as someone who's like really weird. And the other, like, "Hi Jennifer, have a lemonade." Like, the way he says it is like, there's weird choices. But then there's the good acting, particularly the scene I thought which it gets me every time. It's one of the most powerful scenes, is at the start when Jennifer dies and he refuses to leave, and the bully has to drag him away. He's like, "Damn it, we can't just leave her here. No! Oh, no!" Like, you may say that's an over-the-top performance, but sometimes over-the-top performance are appropriate. In that situation, it was appropriate and it worked and it made the scene more powerful. The problem is he does over-the-top performances when it's not appropriate, like the beach scene. Ow! Like, that doesn't... What? What are you doing? Why are you doing that? And this is something, a recurring theme will be with Avery Brooks throughout the shows. There's certain characters that he plays, like mirror universe characters or holodeck characters or something like that are supposed to be big and over the top, and they really work, and he does a really good job playing crazy. Problem is, when he's not playing crazy, doesn't do such a good job, because sometimes he, again, if he's doing mundane shit, it sounds artificial, or he sounds over the top when he shouldn't. Now here's the thing. Guys, since this is Star Trek, I gotta compare him to William Shatner. If you haven't seen my reviews of the original series, I hate William Shatner as an actor. I think he's a terrible actor. As mentioned that Top 10 Actors video, I got some comments about William Shatner, and I was like, no, he's absolute shit. In fact, back then I liked him better. After going through the original series recently, I just realize, like, more and more that I really think that William Shatner is a terrible, terrible actor. There's only one episode in the original series in which he gives a really good performance, City on the Edge of Forever, and that's it. Well, Balance of Terror he was okay in, but mostly it was just City on the Edge of Forever, where Avery Brooks has way more episodes than that where he gives a really good performance, to be fair. And so Avery Brooks isn't anywhere near as bad as Shatner. But he's still a bad actor. I'm sorry, but he is. Or at least a bad film actor. As I said, I'm sure he'd be amazing if you go see him in a play. And he's a good director, and I'll definitely point those out when we get to the episodes that he directs. So yeah. So that's what I have to say about acting. So I feel it necessary to emphasize again how powerful I find the Sisko character story, particularly the scene at the end when he's talking to the wormhole aliens and they're asking him, why do you exist here? You exist here, which I love. And by the way, I was watching this podcast with Robin Duncan McNeil, who plays Tom Paris, and he was saying he was thrown off by the fact that Jennifer's in the bikini on the starship. But I actually love that. I thought that was a great, because it adds, he's like, oh, it's weird. I'm like, it's supposed to be weird. That's the whole point, because these are like weird wormhole aliens that are screwing with linear time, and it's supposed to be strange. And so I love that. I think that worked. But anyway, the moment where they keep pressing him, there's like, you exist here, and then he realizes what he's saying. He's saying, I exist here, and he's like, I don't know if you understand, but a blink of an eye, and at any moment I see her like this, which, by the way, is also good acting. And it, like, none of the consequences prepared you, none of your experience prepared you for the consequences of this act. And he's like, and I've never learned to live beyond that. And he's like in tears. Like, that was a very, very powerful moment. That was like some really good shit. That's why before I watched this episode again, I was thinking that I would love it more, because I remember those powerful moments. But then I forgot that stuff leading up to it wasn't as interesting. But the funny story is, there was a short film that I did twice when I was in college. And I wrote it as a short story before I went to college, and I made it into a short film 2 times, but both are unwatchable. It's just terrible production value. And then I did it as a play locally. Hardly anyone showed up to that one. That was actually a waste of time. But I've always been thinking about revisiting this story, but I never gotten around to it. I probably never will. But after I was like working on like the second film version, I started realizing how heavily influenced I was by this episode, because my story was about a fictional society where all the children are raised separately from the rest of society. So when they're raised in like all the same, sort of a poverty thing, and all the kids are stuck together. And when they turn 18, they have to see this psychic with psychic powers who will determine whether or not they're worthy of entering this utopian perfect paradise. But if she determines they're not worthy, she kills them, because part of the reason why it's a paradise is because they're so selective of who gets in, and therefore they have an abundance of resources. So this psychic person who's genetically engineered to be look young but is 300 years old and can read people's thoughts, she will constantly touch his face and make him relive events, and so he's reliving certain events of his life. He had a girlfriend, Jennifer, who died because when she had her time, she was older than him, and when she turned 18, she was deemed unworthy. So he holds a lot of resentment towards the society and towards that psychic person in particular, blames his girlfriend's death. So, and every time, and the way I filmed it is whenever she touched his cheek, you would see flashbacks and stuff. So I'm sure you can see the similarities in it. Lover named Jennifer who died, and he holds resentment towards someone about it, and he's reliving events of his life, and they flash and go back and forth between the time periods. So yeah, actually that was subconscious. I didn't realize while I was writing that. I didn't set out to be oh yes, like they did in Emissary. It wasn't until much later that I was oh wait a second, this is kind of like Emissary. And even the name Jennifer, that's the biggest thing. You know what? And I think this probably happens in Hollywood. I think it does with professional writers. I think that sometimes they write stuff and they subconsciously are influenced by things they've seen, but they're not realizing it until they actually write it, and then people will be hey, you just ripped off this thing. And they'll be actually, I didn't even. Now that you're pointing it out, yeah, that is kind of similar. But anyway. I would now like to thank my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon. Very much appreciated. It does help me continue with this channel. I would like to give a special thanks to Brandon Neil Howes. Thank you so much for your support throughout the years. Also like to give a shout out to Antarius, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Viles, Alessandro Miguelcio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So we do have a few patron comments on this episode. First comment is from Ricky, who says, "Hooray! Finally, I cannot wait to rewatch this sci-fi masterpiece. I've been vocal that this is my favorite Trek series. However, I will admit that the first 2 seasons were not the best. They were decent, but not amazing, from season 3 onwards. However, as for the pilot itself, it's a strong episode, and I've always liked it. The beginning and entire Sisko character arc is absolutely amazing. I was engaged, I was fascinated, and I always cry in those scenes. When the wormhole aliens are speaking to him and they make him revisit his memories with Jennifer, my God, were these scenes so well done, so well written. All of this was masterclass. Then you have some things in the station and the introduction to other characters, which were okay, but the whole Cardassian conflict in the B story wasn't interesting. It was constantly interfering with the A plot. We also get the introduction to the greatest villain of all Trek, Gul Dukat. Those scenes were good too, but like I said, if I was just their Sisko story, or it was just the Sisko story, I would say this was one of the best pilot episodes and DS9 episodes, but the B-plot brings it down a bit, so my rating is going to be an 8 out of 10. So, that's the other thing about the first 2 seasons not being so good, because I compared it to Next Gen and Enterprise, where their first 2 seasons were not that good, but compared to those, these two seasons are actually a lot better. Like, these first two seasons of DS9 are not anywhere near as bad as the first two seasons of TNG or Enterprise. And Voyager's a different beast, because I actually love the first two seasons of Voyager. It's season 3 and 7 of Voyager that suck. And I'm sorry, but the first two seasons of DS9 are better than season 3 and 7 of Voyager. So they're the worst of the show, but, well, not really season 2, but still, they're kind of the low point of the show, but they're still they're not as bad as the low point of other Star Trek shows, is what I'm saying. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, the introduction of the characters is excellent. You immediately see the sharp contrast between the feel-good harmony on board the Enterprise and the more conflict-ridden atmosphere here. Even the computer acts rebellious. Unlike the conflict between Starfleet and the Maquis board of Voyager, that quickly vanished. The following episodes have a great story arc of the crew learning to get along with each other and building mutual trust. The discovery of the wormhole was very easy. All Dax had to do was correlate some pieces of reports. The Cardassians, who spend a much longer time studying the orbs, never had such a simple idea. The scenes with the prophets were stretched out a little bit too long, and in some moments were on the edge of being boring. Based on their timeless existence, they should know everything about corporeal beings already. The best scene was the meeting with Gul Dukat and Sisko in his office. The dialogue was so great. It's really sad that there's no remastered version. And after watching the TNG Blu-rays lately, DS9 looks poor in contrast. My rating is an 8 out of 10. I talked about this when I did a live discussion on Sacrifice of Angels because I was watching TNG on Blu-rays, and then all of a sudden I go to DS9 on standard definition. And I can only tell the difference if I look for it. Like, if I pay attention, and I was like, yeah, I can see how this is a bit of a fuzzier image. I don't think it's that big of a deal. It doesn't really strike me. Maybe that's just me. I don't really pay attention. I mean, I definitely see the difference, but if I wasn't paying attention, if I wasn't noticing that, if someone didn't tell me it's only in standard definition, then I probably wouldn't notice. But maybe subconsciously notice. But I do agree, though, that I wish they had DS9 high definition. I'm hoping that one day, because right now it's prohibitively expensive and there's no way to do it, but I'm hoping that one day that AI technology will be able to do it cheaper, and that they'll finally do it. Because they can use AI to make it HD, but apparently the result is not very good, and so they don't really want to do that. But hopefully, if they can perfect that technology so they can do it for very cheap, then that's my only hope, that we're going to get HD, DS9, and Voyager. Anyway, next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, if we only looked at the Sisko storyline and maybe also incorporated the introduction of the Bajorans in this episode with respect to the race, who is and why they are important, this would probably be the strongest first episode of perhaps all the Trek series. The careful, focused story about Sisko, his chaotic first day, meeting with Kaiopaka and being considered the emissary, and first meeting with the prophets is strong, powerful, and quite effective. In fact, Emissary is definitely one of the strongest Sisko-centered stories, and probably the best Sisko-centered story in the first two seasons. But this episode also was focused on trying to introduce as many new characters as possible, and in that area it's messy, similar to Encounter at Farpoint. The introductions, especially to Bashir and Odo, were absolutely horrible, and with Dax mainly via an orb flashback. And Kira's story is not quite that effective. In fact, at the point of the first episode, there wasn't much to get to know. And like Kira, maybe because At this point, the writers were thinking of Rolern, who some of us would actually already know after watching TNG. Still, its strengths when we view it as a Sisko story is definitely there, and in terms of the fact we also got introductions of Nog and Dukat in the first episode, it's actually quite impressive, even if the writers may not have realized it at the time. In the past, I gave this episode an 8, but upping it to a 9. Sisko's story, and also we actually got to see Wolf 359 in action, are quite powerful, and the mysterious prophets definitely intriguing. We also got Rom in this episode, although he didn't. Well, he had lines, but you could barely hear him, and he wasn't named, and he only appeared for like 2 seconds, but he was in it. He was in the episode. And of course, Morn was in the episode. Can't forget about Morn. But yeah, I do agree that the introduction of the characters was definitely messy, like in Encounter at Farpoint. Anyway, next comment is from Stephen Kennedy. He says, I really enjoyed the pilot of DS9, my second favorite in the franchise. I was thinking reviewing by air date would be a mistake, but when I thought about it, I agree with your decision. I don't agree with your Captain Liam Shaw reference about the Wolf 359 being already done with Sisko and Picard, because it wasn't really mentioned that much. Only one line, we met in battle at Wolf 359. So the Shaw reference enhanced the battle of Wolf 359. Well, for me and a lot of people, and Star Trek Online has actually brought the battle of Wolf 359, which is amazing, by the way. I don't like what they did in episode 5 of the Picard show with certain characters, so we're even, LOL. I wonder why Sarah wasn't in this episode. Maybe she was at Sisko's restaurant in New Orleans having dinner. J.G. Hutzler, first appearance in DS9 as a Vulcan captain. I can't recall the whole story, as it's about 5 years since I heard it. Ira Stephen Bear told the story about how J.G. Hutzler landed the role as Martok. J.G. Hutzler played a pirate on a TV movie that only played in certain hotels, or it could have played all the time that they visit this hotel. His kids loved this pirate that J.G. Hutzler played, so he was called in for an audition. As they say, the rest is history. I know there was more to this story, but these are the cliff notes. More little stories to come when an actor makes an appearance on DS9, which may be in the next episode. I have another one about J.G. Hutzler that we will have to wait until Enterprise. So my rating is 8 reasons. In my experience, most people wouldn't know reason if it walked up to them and shook their hands, and you can count Gul Dukat among them out of 10. That is a good line. Most people wouldn't know reason if they walked up and shook their hand. So, regarding Captain Shaw, we're going to have to agree to disagree, to very strongly disagree, in fact, on this one, because I couldn't disagree with you more. I really do think that the Liam Shaw thing was just a repeat of what they did here with Sisko. Now, you say it's different because Sisko only said we met in battle at Wolf 359. But here's the thing, the rest was in subtext. Like, there might have been only one overt line, like Shaw had a whole monologue or whatever about his experience at Wolf 359. But in this episode, we actually saw his experience at Wolf 359. Now, granted, he didn't tell this to Picard, but still, the scene, first of all, we see Sisko's experience. We see him face off against Locutus. We see his wife die. And then with the scene of Picard, it's subtext, because you can tell that he fucking hates Picard. He's pissed off. When he says we met at Battle of Wolf 359, that's all he needs to say, because the rest of the scene is very clear that he holds a grudge against Picard and that he can't stand him because of it, and that maintains throughout the episode. Like, whenever they mention Picard, he's like, oh, Picard. And even at the end, he has to fake being polite to Picard in order to maintain his position because he realized he wants to stay, and it's in Picard's hands, so he has to like pretend to be nice to him, but you can tell there's an undercurrent of him not liking him. So I disagree. I think the Shaw thing was not different. I think it was just a repeat of this beat, and I really hated that they did this. I mean, I'm sorry. I was going to say I like Best of Both Worlds just as well as the next guy, but I actually don't. But I still like it. I still like Best of Both Worlds. It is a good, strong episode, but stop referencing it. It's been 30 fucking years. We don't need to always keep going back to this well. I'm kind of sick of it. I'm done with it. I'm done with the Borg. I'm done with a character being pissy at Picard because he was Locutus. It was just a definite repeat, rehash, over again bullshit, and it made me like really hate it. So yeah, we are kind of even because I loved what they did with a certain character in episode 5 of Picard, but I think you know that. But anyway, thank you so much, patrons, for your comments. So my rating for Emissary out of 10 is going to be an 8. Extremely good. I actually came into this thinking I would give it a 9 when I had given it an 8 in the past, but after watching it I was like, yeah, I understand why I gave it an 8 actually. Actually, I understand. It is a bit slow moving, and as I say, there's some things that they should have done. They should have explained more about Bajor. We didn't need the fan service about Wolf 359. Sorry, I know people loved it. I thought it was cool too, but it's not actually helpful to the plot. It would have been helpful. Jennifer's death is helpful, but she could have died another way. Cardassian battle, I'm sorry, that would have been more fitting. Establish what Sisko knows about Cardassian and Bajor, is establish a history of them before you introduce them. Otherwise, it makes them seem, it makes it seem kind of pointless. Clearly explain why the Cardassians evacuated Bajor. Would have been, I think that would have helped Kira's character. I think I had a hard time connecting with Kira's character because I didn't really understand why the fucking Cardassians left. I know the whole Bajoran, it made that whole Bajoran situation a bit fuzzy, and that's what the whole show's going. In fact, they're really vague about Bajor in general. They're like, oh, there's going to be a civil war, there's different factions, and they never really get into any strong details about it until season 2, and even then it's not like crystal clear like why there would be a civil war. So I think all this world building needed to be fleshed out more. They could have spent more time on this instead of the clunky exposition, and saved actually introducing these characters instead of being like, "Hey Oda, you want a coffee? I was from the camp found in this sector and no one knows where I came from." I'm like, all right, Odo, how about the coffee though? Sorry. So, and also even in the whole battle with the Cardassians was kind of boring and really mishandled and doesn't really make any sense, and even the really good stuff with the prophets does drag a little bit, but it was amazing, excellent character story for Sisko. The whole structure of it, starting out with this and that's really a powerful way to begin the show, by starting out with a very tragic moment. Like, it's really tear-inducing. The whole show starts with that scene, so that's powerful. And then they pay it off in the end of the episode by him realizing that he can't move past it and how he's still traumatized and stuck with it, and then forms his decisions, but he's able to sort of relate to these beings in that way. And the whole scene with the prophets, there was a movie that I saw a few years ago, which I won't say what movie it is in case you haven't seen the movie, because it will be a spoiler, but if you have seen the movie, you probably know what I'm talking about, that deals with non-linear aliens. That as soon as I saw it, reminded me so much. Hey, it's Deep Space Nine's Emissary. Reminded me so much of that, although to be fair, I think that movie handled it a little bit better. But still, it reminds me of that, and so it's a good enough. The Sisko story is very powerful, and so it's good enough for me to give it an 8 out of 10, no more. So anyway, that is it for my review of Emissary. So coming up next, on my channel. We're going to stick with Deep Space Nine for a little bit. Wednesday will be my review of episode 2, Past Prologue. Thursday will be my review of A Man Alone. And on Saturday, we're back to TNG, but over on Patreon for revisiting my review for Ship in a Bottle. And then Monday, we come back here and back to DS9 with Babel. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check it out as I continue to cover both Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Next Generation and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.